The sun was shining brightly on a busy afternoon in the heart of the city. People were walking by, chatting with friends, snapping pictures, and enjoying the vibrant atmosphere. Near one of the most iconic landmarks stood a royal guard, stationed in his usual place, standing tall and still like a statue. His uniform was pristine, the red plume on his hat bright against the blue sky, and his posture was perfect. His job was simple: remain alert and protect his post, no matter what happened around him. The royal guards were known for their professionalism and dedication, and they were a symbol of the city's history and pride. On this particular day, however, something unusual was about to happen. A man with a scowl on his face walked into view. He was dressed in casual clothes, but there was something about his body language that seemed off. He kept his head low, and as he walked toward the royal guard, he started muttering under his breath. The man didn't seem like someone who would be impressed by tradition or respect for authority. His dog, a large and energetic breed, trotted along beside him, its leash held loosely in the man's hand. The dog looked around excitedly, its tail wagging as it passed by the crowd, oblivious to the tension building in the air. The man's footsteps grew heavier, and he closed the gap between himself and the royal guard. At first, it seemed like he was just passing by, but his eyes narrowed as he looked at the soldier standing at attention. There was an unmistakable hostility in his gaze. As he approached the royal guard, the man stopped, his dog tugging slightly at the leash. The royal guard remained motionless, his eyes forward, and his face expressionless. This was his job: to stand still, show no emotion, and focus on the task at hand. He had seen all sorts of people pass by, and he had dealt with many who tried to challenge him in one way or another. But today, this man seemed different. The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other and stared directly at the guard. He then muttered something under his breath, making a gesture toward the soldier. It was clear he wasn't just going to walk away like the others. There was something more personal in his actions. The dog began to growl softly, sensing the change in atmosphere. The man gave it a brief command, and the growl turned into a louder, more aggressive bark. People around started to notice the situation, and some of them hesitated, unsure of what was about to happen. The royal guard didn't flinch. He had trained for moments like this, where others might lose their cool. His job wasn't just about standing still, it was about maintaining control in the face of discomfort or aggression. He had been taught to ignore the distractions around him and to remain focused on his duty, no matter the circumstances. But this man wasn't going to let things go that easily. As he stood there, staring down the royal guard, he continued to provoke, his voice louder now as he made rude comments, trying to goad the guard into reacting. The crowd around them grew, some people starting to whisper, wondering if something was going to happen. The man seemed to enjoy the attention, and his dog, sensing its owner's frustration, became more agitated. The scene was charged with a strange energy. While most people would have moved on by now, some couldn't help but watch, captivated by the silent standoff between the man and the royal guard. Would the guard break his silence? Would he respond to the man's taunts? Or would he remain still and unshaken, as he had been trained to do? All eyes were on the two figures. One, a pillar of calm and control. The other, a man trying to make a statement through his words and actions. The man's taunts grew louder, and the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. People around them started to take notice, some stepping closer, others pausing in their tracks, curious about what might happen next. The royal guard, still standing at attention, didn't budge or respond in any way. His face was calm, his eyes fixed ahead, as if nothing in the world could move him from his position. The man seemed to take this as a challenge. He stepped closer to the guard, his dog tugging at the leash, eager to get closer to the soldier. The dog was now growling, its body tense, clearly reacting to its owner's agitation. The man's face twisted into a smile, but there was no humor in it, just a sense of satisfaction, as though he was enjoying seeing the guard remain so composed. You think you can just stand there, pretending to be better than everyone else. the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. The royal guard didn't flinch. He had heard these kinds of insults before. People often tried to get a rise out of him, but he had been trained for situations just like this. He had learned to block out distractions, to ignore the words of others, and focus entirely on his duty. To him, this wasn't just about standing still. It was about discipline, about showing the strength of character to resist being provoked. The crowd around them started to grow, people whispering among themselves, unsure of what was going to happen. Would the man push further, or would the royal guard finally speak? Some were even starting to record the moment on their phones, eager to capture whatever drama might unfold. The man, clearly frustrated by the lack of reaction, turned to his dog and gave it a command. His voice was sharp, and the dog immediately responded, its body tensing as it focused on the guard. The dog barked loudly, its eyes fixed on the soldier. The man smirked, thinking that this would finally get the royal guard to react. He was wrong. The guard's gaze remained unwavering, his posture as solid as ever. Now, the dog began to step forward, its growls getting louder, its body lowering into a stance that suggested it was preparing to attack. The man, still holding the leash, took a step back, but only to make sure the dog was close enough to do what it had been commanded. His eyes locked on the guard, waiting for the response he expected. But the royal guard wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He didn't even glance down at the dog, his focus entirely on his duty. It was as if he had blocked out everything else around him, as if the world had gone silent except for the rhythm of his breath. The dog stopped in its tracks, confused by the guard's stillness. It growled, but its uncertainty was beginning to show. The man barked more orders at the dog, but it wasn't responding as quickly as it had before. The dog seemed to sense something in the calmness of the guard that it couldn't understand. The crowd, now watching with bated breath, began to realize what was happening. They had expected an outburst, a fight, or some kind of reaction from the guard. But instead, they were witnessing something completely different. The royal guard's control over the situation was becoming clearer by the second. Despite all the provocation, all the noise and aggression, he remained completely unfazed. It was almost as if the man's actions were nothing more than background noise to him. The tension was still thick in the air, but the crowd could feel the shift in the dynamics. The man's words were losing their power. His dog, too, seemed to sense that it wasn't going to get what it had been ordered to do. The royal guard, standing tall and composed, had somehow gained control over the situation without ever saying a word. The man, who had started the confrontation, now seemed unsure of how to proceed. The power was no longer in his hands. The man's frustration was beginning to show, his face flushed with anger as he tugged at the leash, trying to make the dog lunge at the royal guard once more. The dog, still uncertain, hesitated, its instincts confused by the unflappable nature of the soldier before it. The crowd was now fully engaged, all eyes locked on the scene. Some people were even holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next, while others whispered to each other, commenting on the guard's incredible composure. The man, however, wasn't ready to give up. His attempts to provoke the guard were becoming more desperate. He shouted louder now, trying to get under the soldier's skin, telling him to do something or move, as if expecting a show of weakness. But the royal guard stood silent and motionless, like a statue in the middle of the square. His unwavering focus made the man's efforts seem more and more futile. With another sharp command, the man pulled the leash harder, causing the dog to growl even louder. The dog, still uncertain, took a few more steps forward, its ears flattened and its body low to the ground. It wasn't exactly attacking, but it was moving closer, sensing its owner's rising anger and the strange stillness of the guard. Yet even with the dog getting closer, the royal guard didn't budge. He didn't shift his gaze or show any sign of being affected by the dog's aggressive behavior. It was as if the situation had become irrelevant to him. His training was kicking in. His ability to remain calm in the face of chaos was exactly what had made him such a perfect candidate for this job. For a moment, there was silence, except for the sound of the dog's occasional growl and the murmurs of the crowd. The royal guard's calm demeanor had created a strange, tense kind of peace. The man, standing just a few feet away, began to look unsure. His face had twisted with anger just moments before, but now his confidence was fading. The dog, despite its initial aggression, was growing restless, no longer certain of its purpose. It stopped moving forward, its gaze darting between the guard and its owner. It was clear now to everyone watching that the royal guard had control of the situation. He had shown no fear, no hesitation, and most importantly, no reaction to the man's attempts to provoke him. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, started to feel a growing sense of respect for the guard's strength. It wasn't about brute force or a loud confrontation. It was about patience, discipline, and an unshakable resolve. They began to watch with even more attention, wondering how long the man could continue to push against someone so calm and composed. The man, seeing that his efforts were going nowhere, began to grow more anxious. His attempts to incite a reaction from the guard had failed, and the reality was sinking in that the situation was slipping out of his hands. The dog, no longer interested in attacking, had stopped growling and stood quietly by its owner. It seemed to be waiting for some kind of direction, but its focus was now scattered. The tension in the air began to dissipate, as the power balance had shifted completely in the royal guard's favor. Still, the man refused to back down. He wasn't used to being ignored, and the idea that his efforts had been in vain made him uncomfortable. He muttered something under his breath, casting a final angry glance at the royal guard. But the guard remained unshaken, as if the man's words had no weight at all. The soldier stood tall, silent and steady, continuing his post with the same calm determination he had when the confrontation had first begun. The crowd, now realizing the depth of the guard's discipline, began to feel a growing admiration for his strength in handling the situation without lifting a finger. The man finally, with a huff of frustration, took a step back, his dog following reluctantly by his side. The moment had passed, and the atmosphere in the square seemed to lighten. The royal guard, still standing as if nothing had happened, had handled the situation with such quiet authority that it left everyone around him in awe. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some people shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed, while others exchanged impressed glances at the guard's unshakable focus. The situation had been diffused not by force, but by the strength of his character. As the man stepped back, still clutching the leash in his hand, he glanced around, clearly frustrated by how things had unfolded. The dog, now calm and obedient, followed its owner without hesitation. The royal guard, however, remained unchanged. His stance was still perfect, his eyes focused straight ahead. It was as if the entire confrontation had never happened, and he was simply fulfilling his duty as if nothing had disturbed his day. The crowd, once tense and unsure of what would happen next, began to relax. People exchanged glances and whispered to each other, some shaking their heads in amazement at the calm strength displayed by the royal guard. It wasn't just the fact that he had stayed so composed, but the way he had handled the situation with such quiet authority that left a lasting impression on everyone around him. There had been no need for shouting, no need for violence. The royal guard had stood his ground, and that was enough to end the confrontation. The man, meanwhile, had lost all sense of control. He had come to this spot hoping to challenge the royal guard, perhaps to provoke a reaction that would prove something to the people around him. But now he stood there, defeated in a way that he hadn't expected. The calmness of the guard had taken away his power. It was as if the man's efforts had been completely ineffective. His dog, now relaxed, walked quietly beside him, no longer interested in the aggression that had once been present. There was a brief moment of awkward silence as the man looked around, trying to save face. He had tried to put on a show of strength, but it had backfired. The crowd had clearly witnessed his failed attempt to provoke the royal guard, and now he seemed to realize that there was no way to salvage the situation. The guard, with his unwavering focus and quiet confidence, had won without lifting a finger. The royal guard's calm presence, however, had left a deeper impact. As the man turned to leave, a few people in the crowd began to applaud, impressed by how the guard had remained so composed. The applause wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was a quiet acknowledgement of the strength and control the guard had shown. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in the loudest actions, but in the ability to remain steady in the face of adversity. As the man walked away, he shot one final glance at the royal guard. But this time, there was no anger in his eyes, only the recognition that he had been outmatched. The guard, of course, didn't acknowledge him. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their attention shifting back to their daily routines, but the feeling of respect for the royal guard lingered in the air. People exchanged quiet comments, some expressing admiration for how the situation had been handled with such professionalism. The incident had ended, but the lesson was clear. It wasn't always about responding to aggression with force, but rather with the strength to remain calm and composed, no matter what. The royal guard remained standing tall at his post, as if nothing had happened at all. He was still a figure of duty and discipline, and his silent victory had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to conflict is simply to stand firm and not let the world push you off course. As the man walked away, clearly defeated, the atmosphere in the square seemed to shift once again. The once tense crowd began to loosen up, with many of them breathing a sigh of relief. People had witnessed a remarkable display of self-control, but now they couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for the royal guard. The situation had been handled with such grace and discipline that it left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. The royal guard, still standing tall and unwavering, didn't let the moment distract him. His duty was to remain at his post, no matter what, and that's exactly what he did. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching, nor did he seek any praise. For him, this was just another day in the life of the soldier sworn to protect and serve. But to the crowd, his calm composure had spoken volumes. Some people who had been quietly observing the situation began to whisper to each other, exchanging stories of how they had seen royal guards in the past. They talked about how disciplined the guards were and how they had always maintained the highest level of professionalism. Today, however, they felt like they had witnessed something special. The way the guard had handled the situation had been a perfect example of what it meant to truly embody strength, not through physical force, but through mental discipline. As the man disappeared from sight, a few of the onlookers turned to the royal guard, nodding with respect. They had seen him in action, and it had left them with a new sense of admiration for his poise and courage. Some even found themselves reflecting on how they might handle their own challenges with the same quiet confidence. The situation had reminded them that standing firm in the face of adversity was often the best course of action, even when others were trying to make you react. A few minutes passed, and the crowd began to disperse, slowly returning to their normal routines. Some people, still processing what they had just seen, continued talking quietly about the incident, impressed by how the royal guard had maintained control of the situation. For many, it was a reminder that real strength didn't always come from physical prowess. Sometimes, the most powerful response to aggression was simply to remain calm and composed, no matter what others tried to provoke. As the last of the onlookers walked away, the square returned to its usual quiet pace. The royal guard remained standing at his post, just as he had been before the confrontation. The day had returned to its peaceful rhythm, and yet something had changed. The royal guard's calmness in the face of hostility had left an imprint on the minds of those who had witnessed it. His quiet strength had proven that you didn't need to respond to every challenge with force or anger. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was stand your ground and stay focused on what truly mattered. As the hours passed, and the square began to empty out, the royal guard continued his watch, unaffected by the commotion that had briefly stirred around him. His job wasn't about seeking attention or proving himself to anyone. It was about being there, doing what was required of him, and maintaining the dignity of his position. For him, the challenge had been nothing more than a brief moment to test his resolve. And as always, he passed with flying colors. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. As time passed and the square returned to its usual pace, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. The once thick tension in the air had now melted into a sense of quiet admiration. Those who had witnessed the scene couldn't stop talking about how impressive the Royal Guard had been. Some of them had been worried that things might escalate into something dangerous, but the way the Guard had handled everything without lifting a finger left them in awe. The calmness he had shown had made an impact far greater than anything words or force could have achieved. While most of the crowd had begun to disperse, there were a few people who lingered near the square, still captivated by the stillness of the Royal Guard. Some approached him, cautiously respectful, offering words of praise for the way he had handled the situation. A few even asked if he was okay, concerned that the confrontation might have shaken him in some way. The Royal Guard, as always, remained composed. He nodded politely but didn't say much. His job wasn't to engage in conversation or seek approval. It was to stand firm and protect his post, regardless of the situation. One man, who had witnessed the entire scene unfold, found himself drawn to the Guard. He had been nearby when the confrontation started, but like most others, he had kept his distance. Now he approached the soldier, feeling the need to express his gratitude. "You did well, back there," he said, his voice sincere. The Royal Guard simply nodded, his gaze still forward, as if the praise wasn't necessary or even expected. It was clear that this wasn't about seeking validation, it was about duty. The man, still in awe, continued, "I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with such control. I think we all expected something to happen, but you just stood there, and it worked." The Guard remained silent, as if lost in his thoughts, but his steady posture never faltered. The man walked away, his mind buzzing with respect for the soldier's discipline and calm in the face of provocation. The Royal Guard's presence was so solid, so unwavering, that it became clear to everyone who had witnessed the event that he wasn't just a symbol of authority. He was a living example of what true strength really meant. It wasn't about fighting back or winning a confrontation. It was about maintaining your integrity, staying focused, and not allowing the outside world to dictate your actions. And that was something that the people around him had never seen more clearly than they did in this moment. As the day wore on and the last of the crowd trickled away, the Royal Guard remained at his post. The world around him had returned to its normal rhythm, but there was something different in the way people looked at him now. They saw not just a soldier, but a person who had mastered the art of inner strength. His calm had not just neutralized the situation, it had left an impression on everyone who had witnessed it. Even though the confrontation had ended hours ago, the story of the Royal Guard's unshakable composure would remain in the minds of the people for a long time. They would talk about how he had faced aggression with quiet resolve and never let anything move him from his duty. They would remember how the power of a calm mind had outshone anything else that could have happened that day. And as they went about their lives, the lesson of that moment would stay with them. That in a world full of chaos and noise, the true strength lies in the ability to remain calm and true to oneself. As the day continued, the scene around the Royal Guard became just another part of the daily routine for most of the people who had witnessed the unusual encounter. However, the events of the past few hours lingered in the minds of many who had been there. Some had been unsure of how things would play out, but now they couldn't stop thinking about the calm, quiet strength the Royal Guard had shown. The way he had handled the situation without ever raising his voice, without ever reacting to the man's taunts, it was something they would carry with them for a long time. As the hours passed, a few people who had been nearby during the confrontation began to talk about what they had seen. They spoke with a sense of awe, recalling the way the Guard had stood firm, unshaken by everything happening around him. For many of them, This was a reminder of the power of silence, of calm in the face of chaos. Some people even admitted they had been afraid of what might have happened, expecting things to escalate. But the guard's response had been a perfect lesson in self-discipline and patience. He had simply stood his ground, never reacting to the aggression or provocation. And in doing so, he had completely neutralized the situation. The more they thought about it, the more impressive it became. Meanwhile, the royal guard remained exactly where he had been, carrying out his duty with the same focus and dedication as before. He didn't seek out praise or recognition. He didn't need to. His job was to stand at his post, and that was exactly what he had done. His training had prepared him for moments like this, teaching him not only how to protect and serve, but also how to keep his composure in the face of adversity. Today, he had proven that he could handle even the most challenging situations with grace and poise. As the sun began to set and the square began to empty out, a sense of peace returned. The quiet murmur of conversation around the square gradually faded, and people went about their business, none of them quite the same as before. It wasn't that they had witnessed a grand heroic act. It was that they had seen a person embody strength in its truest form. The royal guard had shown that sometimes the greatest power comes from within. There was no need for force or aggression. His calm had spoken louder than anything else could have. For those who had been closest to the scene, it wasn't just the guard's strength they remembered, it was his calm determination. In a world that often felt rushed and chaotic, where people sometimes acted on impulse and emotion, the guard had shown that it was possible to face difficult moments with clear-headedness and poise. And that was something that inspired those who had seen it. As the night drew near and the last few people left the area, the royal guard stood firm, still focused on his post. There was no sign of him slowing down or becoming distracted. He remained as composed as ever, his presence a reminder of the power of discipline. The people who had seen the scene unfold would talk about it for a long time, but the guard would simply continue doing his job. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the applause. His satisfaction came from knowing that he had done his duty to the best of his ability. And that was enough. In the end, the most remarkable thing wasn't the confrontation itself, but how the royal guard had handled it. His actions, his unwavering calm, had turned what could have been a chaotic situation into one of quiet triumph. He had shown that true strength isn't always about overpowering others. It's about maintaining control over oneself, no matter what challenges come your way. And that lesson would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. As the day turned into evening, the square that had once been filled with tension had returned to its usual calm. The royal guard stood tall, unmoving, just as he had been since the start of his shift. He didn't seem bothered by the passing hours or the ebbing crowds. His presence, steady and unshaken, was a testament to the discipline and commitment he had sworn to uphold. For him, this was just another day of fulfilling his duties, but for those who had witnessed the earlier incident, it was a moment they wouldn't easily forget. People had come and gone throughout the day, but a few lingered, still talking in hushed tones about what had happened. They spoke with a sense of awe and admiration for the royal guard's calm demeanor and how he had handled the confrontation with such quiet strength. They didn't talk about him using force or making any dramatic gestures. Instead, it was the silence, the stillness he had maintained, that they couldn't stop thinking about. In a world where reactions often came quickly, where people were quick to argue, shout, or even fight, the royal guard's ability to remain undisturbed was a reminder that true strength often lies in restraint. Some of those who had been closest to the scene were still processing the events in their minds. They hadn't expected the situation to unfold as it had. At first, they had thought the man's behavior would escalate into something more serious. They had anticipated a loud exchange, possibly even a physical confrontation. But instead, what they had witnessed was a lesson in patience and composure. The royal guard had remained unmoved, his calm presence rendering the other man's aggression powerless. It was as if the guard's stillness had acted like a shield, preventing any further escalation. Over the course of the day, the story of what had happened spread. Some people who hadn't even been there to see it firsthand were now talking about the Royal Guard's remarkable behavior. They had heard the story from others, and it had left them with a sense of respect and admiration. The quiet strength that the Guard had shown wasn't something they could easily forget. It wasn't often that people saw such calm in the face of provocation, and it served as a powerful reminder that strength wasn't always about physical power or loud displays. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was stay calm, stay focused, and stay true to your purpose. As the last few people left the square and the area returned to its normal pace, the Royal Guard remained where he had stood all day. His posture was still perfect, his gaze still forward. To anyone passing by, he looked just as he always did, like a symbol of strength and discipline. But to those who had witnessed the confrontation, he had become something more. He had become a reminder that in the face of adversity, the strongest thing you could do was hold your ground, remain calm, and stay true to who you were. The day's events might have been over, but the lesson would stay with those who had seen it. The Royal Guard had shown them all that sometimes the most powerful response to a difficult situation wasn't force. It was calmness, focus, and the ability to remain unshaken no matter what challenges you faced. And for the people who had been there, that lesson would continue to resonate with them long after they left the square. It would remind them that no matter how noisy the world became, there was always strength to be found in silence and stillness.